Hi everyone and welcome to week 2 of an introduction to paleontology with the Safe Cultural Heritage Group. As always, I'm Jenny, your mentor, and today we'll be learning about the Cambrian Explosion, which is a pivotal event in Earth's history. In this lecture, you'll be learning about what it was, the key dates, the Palaeogeography and Palaeoclimate, key fauna, key localities, and the triggers or causes of this explosion. It is the Cambrian Explosion. It is the sudden appearance in the fossil record of complex animals with mineralised skeletal remains, as well as more complex trace fossils, because before this, most fossils that we find don't have many skeletal remains, so they don't have hard parts. Which means that they are more like impressions in the rock. The emergence of major animal body plans. It's the first appearance of large, complex animals. There's also an increase of ecosystem complexity. As well as this, it's the idea that Charles Darwin had considered whilst he was writing The Origin of Species. Unfortunately, he wasn't alive to find when these sort of animals were found, so it's kind of just a theory that he was pushing. But however, the Cambrian explosion was not the beginning of multicellular animal life. It's just where we see an increase of fossilisation of them. However, we need to take into consideration that there are a small group of researchers who believe that it should be an event, that it shouldn't be an event, and this instead they think that it should be recognised as a series of pulses in evolution. What are the key dates? The key dates of the Cambrian explosion. It occurred in the early Cambrian, approximately 538.6 million years ago. The overall explosion lasted for around 20 million years. And the Cambrian follows on from the Ediacaran period, which was during the Precambrian, and it dates to about 635 to 541 million years ago. However, the date of the Cambrian and Ediacaran boundary keeps getting moved around. However, most agree that it was roughly 538.6 million years ago. So there is no evidence in the fossil record of Ediacaran animals having skeletal hard parts, and it's kind of unclear whether these organisms were in fact animals. Ediacaran fauna are the oldest defined multicellular organisms. And most of them were kind of worm-like. Some had like discs that went on to look a bit like feathers and on top of them. And we don't really know what the relationship of the organisms from the Ediacaran and the Cambrians are. So it's really difficult to interpret what the relationship between all of the organisms are. Here we have a really useful geological timescale that shows both the Ediacaran and the Cambrian, as well as all the different sort of biotas that occurred during it. What was the Palaeogeography and Palaeoclimate like? So during the Cambrian, the supercontinent Pannotia began to break up, which led to the Iapetus Ocean forming between the different continents. And we had 4 different continents known as Laurentia, Siberia, Baltica and Gondwana. And then the climate, it was generally cold with a gradual warming. Gondwana was covering the South Pole, which changed the directions of the polar currents. Now we're going to move on to one of the most famous Cambrian explosion localities, probably the best known, and it's called the Burgess Shale. So where is it? It's in Yoho National Valley, which is in the Canadian Rocky Mountain Parks, which is in British Columbia, Canada. It was discovered in 1909 by Charles Doolittle Walcott. It was Middle Cambrian in age, which is 510 to 505 million years ago, and its primary geology is shale. Scientists have excavated around 65,000 different specimens from Walcott Quarry alone, and it's really famous for its exceptional preservation of soft-bodied animals, which makes the Burgess Shale a conservat larga strata. So Charles Doolittle Walcott was the founder of the Burgess Shale, and he was an American paleontologist and an administrator of the Smithsonian Institute. So there are two different takes as how to Walcott found the fossils. The first being that his wife's horse slipped, which overturned a rock, which Walcott then hit with his hammer to expose these fossils. Being that as he was walking down the steep slope of the mountain, he stopped and looked down to find his footing, and there was just a fossil in the rock by his foot. There are three main localities where fossils are found in the Burgess Shale. The Walcott Quarry, Raymond Quarry, and Collins Quarry. Walcott Quarry is the first discovered locality. The paleo environment of the Burgess Shale was that of a submarine basin. It's thought that the creatures would have lived in the deeper waters within the basin, and most would have lived at the base of this mass submarine cliff known as Cathedral Escarpment. And the shape of the escarpment would have allowed for mud flows to channel at the base, which then these mud flows then would have enveloped and preserved the fossils there. The Burgess Shale formed by many different mud flows and other deposits flowing in from the flowing through the submarine basin. So, how did it form overall? So, the first was that organisms were living at the bottom of the platform. Sediment, which was most likely mud, rapidly gets deposited, covering the organisms. Additional layers of sediment get deposited, flattening, which is compressing the organisms, as well as the mud surrounding them, forming mudstones. These mudstones then, when compressed, they often form shale. And then gradually the sediment layers come up to the surface via erosion, exposing the fossiliferous rock. We'll be going through the fauna of the Burgess Shale. So overall, there's been 150 different species of animals, algae, and bacteria which have been described to date. In this diagram, we can see the difference in the Burgess Shale organisms amounts that we wouldn't have known about without the exceptional preservation. For example, we would only really get the ones with skeletalized hard parts. And then now we'll be going through some of the more interesting and kind of weird species that have been found in the Burgess Shale. The first organism we'll be talking about is a nomalocaris, and it was this really cool organism. It was the largest Cambrian predator found in the Burgess Shale because it measured around 30 centimetres in length, which was pretty big considering the rest of the organisms that are found there. It had large eyes on stalks, grasping limbs on the front there, swimming lobes, and a tooth-like mouth parts. And what's quite interesting about nomalocaris was that it was first described with different, its different parts were described separately. So, for example, its frontal appendages were thought to be shrimp, and its mouth part was thought to be a jellyfish fossil. So, finally, during the 1950s, when these fossils were getting prepared, they found that the shrimp attached to a head which contained the jellyfish fossil. And then they just carried on prepping and found this really cool fossil of a nomalocaris. I thought that a nomalocaris was a predator. This is because the eyes were on a stalk, as well as its large frontal appendages and its tooth-like mouth parts. The second organism that we'll be talking about is a Hallucigenia, and this is a lobopodian worm, and it measured around 0.5 to 5.5 centimetres in length. It's thought to be a scavenger. So originally it was described to have walked on these spines, and it had tentacles on top, which were thought to be feeding apparatuses, and that was by Conway Morris. However, it was later suggested that these tentacles were actually the legs and the spines were for defence. So it had just really been described upside down. Let's move on to Marella, which is one of the most common animals found in the Burgess Shale, with over 25,000 specimens that had been collected, which was last calculated around 2006. But I'm sure there's been many, many more since then. It's measured around 2 centimetres or less in length, and it was the first fossil that was collected by Walcott, and Walcott informally called Marella lace crabs. And it's currently accepted that this is actually a stem group arthropod, and there is evidence of Marella molting and shedding its exoskeleton, and it's thought to have been a benthic bottom-dwelling scavenger. Wiwaxia was is this really weird little animal. It's bilaterally symmetrical and it measures around 5 centimetres in length, and it's almost fully covered with an array of scale-like elements known as sclerites. It has a feeding apparatus which is similar to soft-body organisms known as odontogryphus, which were also from the Burgess Shale, which is thought to have eaten things like cyanobacterial mats that grew on the sea floor. And it's really heavily debated what Wiwaxia's phylogeny is. Now we move on to my absolute favourite Burgess Shale organism, which is known as Opabinia, which is an nomalocaris, which is the same family as the one that we saw earlier. It had 5 eyes, a proboscis, which is 4 times longer than the head, and a backwards facing mouth. So the proboscis is thought that it was used to grasp food and push it towards its mouth, kind of like what an elephant does with its trunk. And Opabinia measured around 7 centimetres in length, and it's really rare within the Burgess Shale. We'll move on to Pikaia, which is thought to be one of the earliest chordates, which means it has a backbone, as it has a presence of a proto-notochord. It measured around 5.5 centimetres in length, it had a well-defined head with antennae-like tentacles, and there's around 100 myomeres along the body, and myomeres allowed for the movement, swimming side to side, and they're early muscles, and it's considered to be a primitive chordate, which is an organism which include us and other animals, which include fish, birds, reptiles, as well as sea squirts and lancelets. So the notochord is a primitive start of the backbone, highlighted here in blue. In humans, it forms during pregnancy and it turns into the vertebral column. Notochords have been found in several basal chordates from the Cambrian. Another example, as well as Pikaia, being Hycoichthyes, which is from the Chengjiang Formation in China. And it's made out of tissues similar to the cartilage surrounding the nervous system. And it lies along the front to back, so the head to tail axis, kind of like what our vertebral column does. The locations of the main Burgess Shale type localities. There's over 40 localities worldwide which exhibit Burgess Shale type preservation. So some key ones include the Wheeler and Marjum formations in Utah in the USA, Sirius Passet in Greenland, Shengjiang in China, and Emu Bay in Australia. Finally, we will talk now about the triggers or the causes of the Cambrian explosion. So these are 3 different categories that have been proposed that are the triggers of the Cambrian explosion: environmental, ecological, and evolutionary. With environmental. So the first trigger that has been proposed was oxygenation, and it was thought that this would be the cause of the Cambrian explosion. However, there is a lack of precise values of oxygen levels before and during the diversification. So there should be a variation in oxygen levels at the Ediacaran and Cambrian boundary, but there just isn't. The iron content in rocks that are Cambrian in age suggest a well-oxygenated shallow waters. The environmental factor was glaciation, and some researchers have suggested that the entire Earth was covered with ice before the Cambrian explosion, which is known as snowball Earth. Snowball Earth has been found to have occurred, but it ended at around 635 million years ago, which is 100 million years before the Cambrian explosion. So the ice from the snowball Earth would have limited the amount of niches that would have been in the sea, and it would have blocked sunlight. So once the glaciation melted, more areas suddenly became available to exploit. So yes, that is a good point. However, we're unsure. And final environmental trigger was the nutrient influx. So this is when the formation of the continents and oceans, as well as mountains on the continents, would have allowed for an increase of primary production, which means that these events would have led for nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen to enter the sea. There were three major mountain building events which occurred. The East African Orogen, which is 750 to 620 million years ago, the Brasilina and Damara Orogen, which is 630 to 520 million years ago, and the Kuungan Orogen, 570 to 530 million years ago. So orogeny is the term for mountain building. As well as this, we had the formation of supercontinents, which roughly occurred at the same time as the Cambrian explosion, as well as the Iapetus ocean opening during the Cambrian, which is good. But the increase in nutrients was probably not linked to the increase of diversity, which means the number of species, or with the increase of disparity, which is the number of phyla. To the ecological triggers that may have occurred. So the Cambrian explosion is thought to have maybe occurred as a result of co-evolution, with some organisms being forced to evolve by the changes within the ecosystem. For example, predators evolve, so organisms may evolve different skeletal elements, such as spikes or becoming more faster for protection, and body plans would have been better adapted for swimming, to evolve, to escape, really. The logical point was that previously unexploited niches and environments could now be lived in, which allowed for adaptations of organisms better suited for those environments. And we have these things called ecosystem engineers, which are organisms that can modify an abiotic environment. So it's a species that creates, modifies, or destroys the niches of other species, such as archaeocyanid reefs. And archaeocyanid reefs are extinct sessile reef-building marine organisms, and which would have allowed for more organisms to live in those niches because they created a biotic environment out of an abiotic environment. Let's move on to the evolutionary triggers of the Cambrian explosion. So the animal body plan is controlled by genoregulatory networks, which are known as GRNs, as well as these genes called HOX genes, which is the informal way of saying Homeobox genes. And these are the master control genes, and one mutation of a HOX gene in an ancestral organism could potentially cause a massive morphological change in the descendant. And an example of this are eyes. Eyes were found in a organism from the Xinjiang Formation in China, which is roughly 520 million years ago, which is older than the Burgess Shale. Several other taxa from the Xinjiang Formation also have eyes, but the most famous is Cindarella eucalla, which is a non-trilobite arthropod. And specimens are usually around 5 to 13 centimetres long, and there are over 2,000 matidia, which are the single units of a compound iron arthropods, in each eye. So the occurrence of eyes within the Xinjiang shows that there are lots of different visual systems, and it's the earliest record of eyes in the Metazoan fossil record. And Cindarella was the oldest organism to have highly developed vision from the early Cambrian. More likely that the Cambrian explosion was triggered by numerous interrelated causes of evolutionary, ecological, and environmental factors. The further reading, I've also included some podcasts from Paleocast. I listen to these most days on my way to and from work, and I will copy and paste this and put it on a comment for you all to access the links. References. None of this could have been possible without information from the Royal Ontario Museum's Burgess Shale website, which is where I got quite a lot of the photos from, and I would just definitely check out that website because it's great. So yeah, here are the references. We will be learning about Devonian fish and the fin to limb transition. So we'll be learning about what they were, key dates, Palaeogeography and Palaeoclimate, key fauna, key localities, the fin to limb transition, its key organisms and the evidence, and we'll be looking at this absolutely monstrous boy known as Dunkleosteus. So thanks! You can find Safe Cultural Heritage Group on all these links here, and you can find me on these links. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye!